Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of ADAR Unveiled. I'm your host, Chrissy Hudson, and as always, I am joined by ADAR's executive leadership team, Dan Kelly, Doug Farrington, and Arie Bos. Today, we're diving into a pressing issue that has captured headlines around the world: farmers protesting in Europe. From tractors barricading roadways to farmers resorting to unconventional practices like throwing vegetables and spraying manure, this protest movement has certainly grabbed attention. So, whether you're based in Europe and have experienced these demonstrations firsthand, or you've caught glimpses of them on global media, in this episode, we're going to shed light on the underlying reasons that are driving these demonstrations. Hopefully, we can provide some additional information as to what's happening currently in Europe and what that means for the rest of the world. But we're not just going to talk about the problem. We're also going to discuss potential solutions to the challenges that they're facing. And you guessed it, ADAR's ADS technology can play a pivotal role in addressing these challenges. As always, we've reserved time at the end of today's conversation for Q&A. So if you have a question, please drop it in the comments below, and we will do our best to get to those questions at the end of today's segment. If we don't have time to get to your question, please know that as soon as we wrap up here, our team will dive in and begin answering your questions. So, guys, let's get started because we have a lot of important information to talk about today. Arie, we're actually going to start with you because not only are you based in Europe, but you're actually based in the Netherlands. And the Netherlands may be small but mighty, right? And your country has played a pivotal role within what is currently happening across a lot of countries in Europe. So, what specific aspects of European agricultural policies are causing the most frustration among farmers? Can you give us kind of some background as far as how we got to where we are today?
Well, thank you very much, Chrissy, and hello, everyone. The European farmers' protests have now got worldwide attention, but there is a long history behind it. And I thought, and I put together some facts so that everybody can understand why these protests happen and where it will lead to. So if you look, for instance, at the map of Europe, and I'll share my screen with you so you have a little bit of an idea what we're talking about here. Okay, so you see the Netherlands is actually a very small country in the northwest part of Europe. And however, we have a big agricultural sector. And if you look at the numbers, this country is as big as West Virginia, right? It's a very small country. And I found this map on the internet and it had Charleston on it. So I thought, I live in Rotterdam, so everybody can see where I am here. Now, if you look at the country's agricultural economics, in 2023, right, we had the Dutch market consumed $45 billion in agricultural goods. But our farmers are doing much better job than that, and they also export $130 billion to everywhere in the world. So our total ag sector is $175 billion. And that means that for this small country, it's extremely intensive agriculture. Now, of course, that's great, but after decades of farming and just growing, right? There was also a price to pay. Heavy pollution of air, heavy pollution of ammonia, soil contamination, the killing of top layers in the soil, and many other things. So since 1990, the European regulations were tightened and said we have to move towards greener farming, right? And with less environmental impact. And over all these years, these regulations have become much more stringent. Now, if you look at actually what the ag sector does in the Netherlands, our economy is, or our country has only 17.3 million people, but we have 11.3 million pigs or hogs, and we have 3.8 million cows.
Mhm.
And if you look at what this means for the economy, you see that, for instance, the use of agricultural land is 54% of our entire nation. But you see that they only contribute 7% to the gross national product. So there's a bit of a difference there, right? And if you look at the CO2 production from agriculture, which is more than 40% from everything that is being produced by industry, by traffic, by airplanes, by whatever, right? 40% is due to agriculture, while only 7.4% of the employment is being created by agriculture. So only 7.4% of the working labor force works in agriculture. So you see there's a mismatch here. Now, another price to pay was that overall all these years, the quality of the soil went down due to, I'm not going into too many details here, but due to the traffic, to the fertilizers and many other things. So the High Court in the Netherlands decided 4 or 5 years ago, 2019, that the Netherlands had to follow European rules much more than we did before. So there was no loose law anymore. It was kept very strict from there on. The Dutch government was the first to act on this and exactly abide by European regulations. And that meant that, for instance, 50% reduction of ammonia production in 2030 must be accomplished, which is a big problem, because if you look at it now, a farmer can produce 170 kilos per hectare. This is a European thing, but it means 150 pounds per acre of nitrogen-based products. And everywhere in the world, the farmers produce much and much more. So if you look at the production of manure, and this is actually where we are going towards, right, today, manure, it's 176 billion pounds in a few years from now, 2026. That's the expectation of the Dutch Governmental Agricultural Bureau. That means 400,000 truckloads of manure that has to be transported in 1 year. And you cannot just spread it out over the land anymore. It's only a few percent, and the rest must be industrially processed. And the cost of that will be about 3.5 billion euros to the Dutch farmers. So all these regulations make farmers very nervous, and they stepped up and even started their own political party, one issue party only for the farmers, which was a bit of a problem. But they, from tradition, I think that's everywhere in the world, right? Farmers get a lot of sympathy from the people. Yeah. So here they got a lot of votes during the elections, and then new action groups came up, like Farmers Defense Force, which is this one, a very a militant group actually of farmers that started protests and even violent protests and doing all kinds of things that were against the law. But and you see here on June 4, this is 2 months from now, they're going to Brussels they organized a big European protest in Brussels. And what they do, I show you some pictures here from the last few months, right? You see they block the roads, they block the borders of the country, and you see hundreds and hundreds of tractors here. They protest, proud to be a farmer, no farmers, no food. They created fires and havoc on the motorways, and so their business of their main reason for their protest were the NH3 policy, of course, caused by Europe, the loss of business because they have to shrink down their business in order not to produce that much. So they had a lot of reasons to be worried. And now you see that what they have done has been followed in many other European countries. This is Italy, left, Spain, bottom left, Poland, the most funny one actually from Germany. It says "Ohne Bauern kein Bier," meaning without farmers there is no beer.
Yeah.
Which is
The most
basically true,
important
right? Which is true. And I think that that is one of the most important statements of today that we should all keep in mind. But anyway, that has led to this situation that you see in the most important European countries. These farmer protests has really gained traction, and they all will be together in 2 months here in Belgium, where the European capital Brussels is, and it is expected that thousands and thousands of these tractors will completely block the city, and even and it will be a big problem. Anyway, so this is a little bit the background of it.
Yeah, Arie, I got a question. So, as a lot of people know, I read the Wall Street Journal every morning, and when I know something is really hitting the world stage, it's usually in that paper, if you will, and it's literally been in the front page of the Wall Street Journal 2 or 3 times, I'd say, over the last 6 months, which is pretty incredible, actually, just showing the impact. How is the media covering it in the Netherlands specifically? Are they covering it as far as we have radicals that are a small niche part of the population that are basically pushing this movement, which have created their own political movement, or is it more of a generalist populist type of positioning as far as something has to change?
That's a very good point. It's a bit of both, right? There are some radical groups, and I just have this newspaper here that you can see that farmers set fire on the highways and all kinds of problems. So those are a small group of really radical ones. Those are they call themselves the Farmers Defense Force. Now, but in general, it is being covered by the media every day. Around that small, more fanatical groups, there's a big political movement now. It's called the civilian farmer movement in Dutch, and they won many votes during the last elections. So it is not just an outside group of radicals anymore. It is a broad spread of interest and sympathy that people have. Although, because of that radical actions, a lot of that sympathy has also been lost again. But what is interesting then on this is that, for instance, last week the European Union has put some relief on all these measurements in order to accommodate the farmers a bit more and to avoid future problems.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just interesting when you view the press and how they take different situations depending on where you're reading it, what medium you're reading it from, etc. So that's good insight, because I think a lot of our viewers here of this webinar series we have are coming from the U.S., where our European numbers are actually accelerating faster by percentage basis than the U.S., which is awesome. So it's good to get your perspective on it here as well. So
when farmers are trying to meet those restrictions and those regulations, all of a sudden that impacts their bottom line. And we know that in the world of agriculture, margins are slim already. So that means tighter pressure. So the reality is, even though protests are happening in Europe, farmers around the world, I know specifically in the US, are facing similar struggles. Doug, can you speak some to how, I kind of mentioned some of that overlap, but can you speak some to how those challenges are felt in other places like the US and outside of the US?
So let's start with the US. First off, in the US, every livestock farmer has an approved manure management plan, right? So, or they wouldn't be operating. So that's in place. But you alluded to some struggles with farmers here in the US, Chrissy. Obviously, with inflation, prices are going up. So feeding the family is harder, right? But also you got wages going up, minimum wages going up in certain areas. On top of that, right? So there's a squeeze happening And on top of that, we've got tighter regulations in the US as well, especially around water quality, right? There's, obviously the soil degradation that Arie talked about. We have those issues here as well, air quality, odor, et cetera. But primarily water quality is the big issue. It is a big issue here. And in fact, right around me in North Carolina, a number of farmers, a number of pork producers especially, are going out of business. They're shutting down operations, right? Because they just cannot make a profit and still comply with these new regulations. All right. Now, if we look around the world, there's many countries that have policies around manure management, but the enforcement is really weak. So you don't really hear as much protesting and so forth because the enforcement's not there, right? So that's an issue. And then conversely, there's countries like El Salvador where there is no policy, but yet they're very good at managing, having an integrated manure management plan. So it's kind of all over the board, but primarily, I think the issues we're facing are in the US and in Europe.
So how do you all see the current protests that are happening in Europe shaping agricultural policy specifically to Europe, but also impacting policy around the world?
There's a few different points here. One, I'd say we're all covering it. There's rising costs to operate. So, at the end of the day, farming is a business. It's a livelihood, but it's also a business. And the bottom line is there's rising costs everywhere, from energy to fertilizers to transportation. So that's not just inflation based, it's actually policy based as well. And so this is what's happening. So, and there's also declining farm gate prices. So you've got increasing costs, lower revenue, you've got a squeeze as Doug has shared. So the bottom line is, from a policy perspective, we got to ensure fair pricing mechanisms are in place to create a floor price, if you will, or a floor take for farmers. And it's quite frankly as simple as that, because it's a national security issue, not just for the US, which we hear about all the time, but for the European Union as well. Another recent event in the world, obviously, we all know about the war in Ukraine. There are, correct me if I'm wrong, Arie, but one of the main catalysts that sparked off a lot of these protests were, quite frankly, the cheap agriculture imports coming from Ukraine.
Especially in Poland, correct? Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And we all understand the reason for that, to basically keep Ukraine's economy afloat in the midst of a national crisis and a regional crisis. But the downstream impact, is farmers such as in the Netherlands that are, quite frankly, being priced out of the market. We've got a supply and demand issue here. So the bottom line is there's this massive influx of cheap agriculture imports that are affecting everyone within the homeland, if you will. And so from a policy perspective, to answer your question directly, there's got to be a very specific balance between domestic agriculture support, meaning a minimum amount deployed into your local market, as well as maintaining trade relationships externally. And Arie put up a nice graph before this showing how much is actually exported. Well, when you have got a bunch of imports coming in because of just short-term trade mechanisms put in place by policymakers, it throws those numbers completely out of whack, and that's why you see some of the downward impact here. And so we need to understand how the climate policies are actually safeguarding farmers' interests as well, not just those because we have a specific goal in 2030. There has to be a very close eye on what is impacting the local market on a quarterly basis, not just, here's what our target is. And I think that's been lost a little bit, and at least that's what we're hearing specifically from the farmers and the growers in Western Europe specifically. Another thing on the trade deals, there's been a massive opposition in the European, and I follow the news very closely here. I'm in the US, but I follow it closely the best I can. I know there's a massive amount of opposition to Latin America trade deal facilitating specifically beef imports into Europe. I know that's been a big deal. Arie showed a slide, specifically on pigs versus cows. And so every time you're doing that, you're cutting off basically a market there within that slide. So again, we got to show the and have a clear conscience on what the short-term impacts are versus long-term goals. You know, there's got to be a balance between this land use concept and biodiversity. You know, they have to figure out a very clear goal setting exercise between the requirements for production to keep people alive, as well as environmental conservation, which is coming out of more kind of the 2030, 2045 goal setting. But the bottom line is we can't just constantly change and squeeze prices and margins and squeeze land use. It just doesn't work that way. You don't need to be an
that's
economic.
an interesting point that you made, because one of the reasons here in Europe from the farmers that they got so tired of changing rules and regulations every year, right? They don't know who are we dealing with? What will the government do next year? What will the European Union do next year? Can I invest or not? Right? It's a very difficult life for them now because of the regulations.
Right. Yeah, it's hard to foresee what's coming around the corner, depending on where the wind is blowing, if you will.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, I mean, the one thing that is staying consistent, though, I think is for sure that it's going to affect policymakers is the need for innovation. And that term is a very broadly used term, but everybody within the ag sector understands that. Ultimately, improving your yield based on what you have today. And that's what we are proud that we're enabling for many farmers on behalf of ADAR. And so we can talk more about that later. But that's something that I'm personally very proud of that we're doing, and that we're basically improving yield and creating circular economies. So that's a long-winded answer to a short question, Chrissy. Sorry.
That's okay, but you gave us a great transition, because guys, we are done talking about the problems. It's time to start talking about the solutions, right? The reality is we know that what's happening currently in Europe is a multifaceted issue, right? There is not one sole solution that will fix everything. What we know is that the resolution will take collaboration from farmers and innovators and policymakers all together on the same page to reach an agreement that balances everything that needs to be balanced. The beauty is that ADAR and our ADS technology provides a solution that absolutely can be pivotal in the innovation space. So Arie, as the inventor of the ADS technology, would you provide a brief overview of ADS as it specifically relates to agriculture?
The cost of industrial processing as imposed by the European Union are so high. They're up to 40 euros, so $44 per metric ton. These costs are unbearable almost in the future for the farmers, right? With our technology, and we have tested it many times with all kinds of manures, even sewage sludge, which is also a kind of manure, and we addressed that in our previous live stream, you remember. But we can process the manure instantly and make a dry powder of it, sanitized as well. So that means that with one of our devices, the farmers can immediately process the manure before it actually creates NH3 on the farm, right? So that whole NH3 big problem and the enormous load and stress for farmers can be relieved at reasonable costs, instead of having to process it industrially for these very high tariffs that I just mentioned to you. So we are now building our Gen 4 machine here in the Netherlands, and we expect to eradicate this ammonia instantly from the manure. We have already done tests with heavy charged ammonia liquids, much more than manure, and that worked great. So we try to create a fully circular economy, so reducing the costs for farmers. That is my personal goal.
One of the benefits that people have told me when they think about a simple solution to use is that ADAR effectively allows them to hit the easy button a little bit, which is a kind of a coin phrase in the US, because there's a popular commercial in the US with Staples, and they've got the easy button, and it was a wonderful marketing campaign, right? And people relate ADAR and our ADS technology to that, because quite frankly, we just have 4 buttons. So
Yeah.
each one is an easy button, right?
Yeah.
And so you hit that, the machine, you know, basically waste goes through and out comes a usable product that everybody knows how to do. It's just the actual development of the sustainable farming practices is very cumbersome for a lot of farmers, because one, either they don't have the money to buy all this disparate equipment. 2, they don't have the time to educate themselves on how to increase yield and soil productivity and soil health, you know, or 3, they just don't want to bother with it, quite frankly. And, you know, and this is a lifestyle versus profitability. So I'm just curious if you've seen any of that over in Europe, as far as the inconsistent level of precision farming or just farming practices in general to get the most yield out of their acre. Are you seeing that at all over there, Arie? Because we see it all the
Yeah,
time.
you see that. You see that a lot, actually. Dan. You know, in the old days, farmers could spread it out over the land using big, heavy tank loads and big, heavy tractors. You know, they compressed the soil and everything, and that had to stop. So now they are only allowed to do that for 6 weeks in the year, in early February, and only maybe maximum 20% of the total production of manure. The rest must be industrially processed, and that is a problem. But if you look at what you use the term precision fertilization, right? That is very difficult. You cannot do that with land spread. It's simply not possible. What you could do with the material that we produce when we process it in our ADS systems, out comes dry powder, right? With fibers up to, let's say, 1/10 of an inch, right? 2.5 millimeters. There's still a little bit of moisture in there, so it's very easy to make pellets of it, right? And these pellets can be used much better in precision fertilization, because now the farmer has a robot, right? It makes a hole in the ground, it puts in a few of those pellets, it puts the seedling in it, it compresses the ground again. So you not only have the manure and its biological ingredients and its minerals where the plant roots are, but not around. So the soil around it stays clean, can recover, and biologically grow again for the next few years when you make the next plant in the next year. So this way you keep the soil fertile, you keep it healthy, and you maintain or bring back the biological life. So precision fertilization is absolutely the way to go in the future.
Right. So it opens up a new value stream, if you will. But we also at ADAR, you know, we see that there's opportunities to potentially blend other waste stream materials in with manure to create kind of a super nutrient, if you will, that may have attributes of a soil amendment, of a biostimulant, etc., built right into the same material. So we're working on research and development right now to look at those different opportunities and stuff that's going into the landfill today. And then lastly, I don't know if Arie mentioned it or not, I don't remember, but we have plans to build a mobile unit for smaller farmers where we can actually transport a unit in, process a farmer's material, and move on to the next farm, right? So we have a number of things in the works that we believe will really help farmers have a better outcome in the future.
Yeah, definitely some excitement.
There's this need for, like in the US specifically, the co-op is kind of the center of the universe for a lot of farmers, specifically small farmers, right? It's where they get their agronomic advice, it's where they get their products, it's where they sell products sometimes, etc. It just depends on where you are and what you're selling and what you're producing. But enabling that hub and spoke model for farmers and smallholders is going to be, quite frankly, a game changer for us and for them. You know, so I want to mention one thing though. Also, the fact that we just use electricity versus natural gas is another thing we're hearing. We're quite frankly a game changer. And so when we're using 55 kilowatts an hour, some of our material shows 75 kilowatts an hour. That was Gen 3 to be clear. Our Gen 4 devices keeps getting more efficient. And so the more and more we can create a carbon neutral or even carbon negative approach to farming is going to help everyone meet their sustainability requirements that are even being pushed down from policymakers within the region. And so there's a thing called compulsory tax, which actually Doug talks about a lot. And in the US, it's in California, up in Canada. We've got it all over Europe related to the amount of carbon emission you're pushing. So imagine if you had a solution that you could take that concern off the table completely, and instead actually get paid for what you're producing through carbon credits. We'll talk more about that later. So those are some of the key environmental benefits, Chrissy, just in the sake of time.
All right. And speaking of time, we are going to transition into Q&A. So give me just a moment and we will take a look and see what questions that we have out there. We have time for just a couple.
While she's looking, Arie, do you think you could have your design team actually print the word easy on our start button?
Yeah, I can print that, Doug. Yeah, and I'll put it in with big 1 feet high letters.
Yeah, that was easy.
Yeah, very easy.
All right, got our first question. So earlier we were talking about precision agriculture. What strategies can be implemented to encourage the adoption of precision farming techniques and increase yields while trying to minimize environmental impact? Who wants to take? Okay, Doug.
Heavy question.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And first off, you really have to understand that farmers are not likely to adopt new technologies or new practices unless there's an economic advantage, right? There's a lot at stake for farmers. You know, that's their lifestyle. It's their family livelihood. It's their ability to contribute to a thriving community. And it's their legacy, right? So they're not going to take chances on that. You know, there's been said that farmers have 40 chances to get it right because they farm for an average of 40 years, but they also have 40 chances to get it wrong. And just one wrong year can actually be the end of that legacy, right? So there's a lot at stake here for farmers. They're not going to move unless they're pretty sure it's going to work, right? So to overcome that, secondly, you know, farmers need to be part of the solution. That, you know, we're looking for, you know, it can't be forced on them. They've got to be part of the solution. They're wonderful innovators. I come from a family of farming, and I can tell you, my grandfather, before YouTube and the internet was out there, ChatGPT, he was using baling wire and rope and string and tape and all kinds of good stuff. And he was a great innovator, right? But I think we have to be very clear on what the vision is for renewable agriculture in the future and what role these farmers are going to play in that. They need to understand that because right now they're threatened. They don't see their role. They don't see the future potentially, and they don't see their role in that future. So we have to make it clear what their role is, right? Another thing I think is we need to provide more subsidies to help with the transition. And that could be industry, that could be government. In terms of industry, it might be setting up trials, you know, strip trials, where you run a control strip and a trial strip right next to it, and you can measure the outcomes, right? And that trial strip could be potentially subsidized with free software, free services, free product, free trial equipment, maybe a money back or a performance-based offer. And from a government perspective, we could be looking at tax credits or credit guarantees, right? That would help them have a low risk investment in trying new things, right? So I think that's important, and sharing the outcomes, whether it's successful or not successful. We can't cherry pick the data and say, just look at this data. It's got to be very transparent and let every farmer see it, right? And then thirdly, I would say, you know, we need to figure out a way to incentivize carbon reduction, right? Farming is very carbon intensive when you think about the fuel usage, the synthetic fertilizers, methane produced, the ammonia produced, Arie's talked about. It's very carbon intensive. And if you said there's a way to reduce that carbon intensity, a farmer might say, okay, how do I benefit from that? I'm not getting an economic benefit. So we need to figure out a way that a farmer can get an economic benefit from reducing those that carbon intensity, and that could be basically through setting up premium pricing on the products they produce, whether it be animal meat or crops, right? And if we can pass that carbon intensity on to producers or processors downstream, where they can then offset some of their high carbon intensity activities with this carbon reduction score, essentially from the farmers, that could incent them to pay more for the product, providing more income to the farmers. So I think there's a combination of things we need to do here to incentivize, and create a strategy around adopting precision farming practices.
All right, guys, we are totally out of time. Any
Sorry,
last,
Chrissy.
it's been a great discussion, and I think it's been very needed. Just like we said at the very beginning, it's always helpful to look at international events, especially through the eyes of someone who is there, who's experiencing them firsthand, who's absorbing, media content by people who were observing the events firsthand, right? It helps all of us to be able to put things in perspective. So I'm really glad for today's discussion. Any closing thoughts as we wrap up?
I was just going to say, farmers have enough risks as it is with weather and other events, and I think that's part of what we can do as a society is help reduce risk of trying new things.
Yeah, I would agree, Doug. Farming is like gambling every year.
It is, man.
And you don't win every year. I mean, nobody wins 100%. Yeah, and the more risk we can take out of that equation, because we know, well, every producer knows they'll have waste, right? And the amount of opportunity to produce something with that waste, because you'll have waste, creates more sustainability, more security for the whole farming industry, because they know they have another revenue stream coming from somewhere else versus always relying on crop insurance, as an example. So that's why I'm personally so proud of what we're doing, because we're enabling a whole new market opportunity for farmers that are working their ass off around the world, try to make it $1, and this gives them another opportunity to do it.
Absolutely. All right. Dan, Doug, and Arie, thank you all again for a wonderful and very informative discussion. Everyone, if you are not already following ADAR Technologies on social media, we are on LinkedIn, we are on Facebook, we're on Instagram, we're on X. You name the platform, we are probably there. Just search for @ADAR Tech or @ADAR Tech and the number 1. You can also visit our website at www.adartech.com.